pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. David Burton-Pye. David was a conservation officer for South Staffordshire for over 30 years. He was awarded the MBE for services to tourism and conservation in 2002. That wasn't that long ago, was it?
24 years.
Just doesn't seem when you talk about it in terms like that. Very keen photographer, and he's used his skills to enhance the presentations, as we'll see. He covers a number of related topics. After establishing his consultancy as a chartered town planner, he assisted over 200 award-winning conservation projects. So really good, including best restoration of a timber-framed building in England. So I'm sure we're all looking forward to this. I've no idea what to expect, so which is really good. Timber-framed tales. So let's give a nice warm welcome to David.
Thank you, Linda. So, it's the second time I've given this presentation. It had its world premiere at my own organisation a few weeks ago, which is the Cotswold and Millbrook History Society. And it seemed to go down fairly well, and it's something I've wanted to work on as a presentation for many years, because I've worked with all sorts of buildings, from one-up, one-down cottages through to the biggest listed building in the county of Staffordshire, which is Patsell Hall, which is 150 rooms on 5 floors. It took me 2 years there to find out how to get from that room in the basement to that room in the 4th tower. But timber frames is what I want to concentrate on. They're my favourite kind of historic building. So, timber frame tales. So, in the beginning, and we'll start at the very beginning because somebody once said it's a very good place to start. And we all know that great oaks from acorns grow. And if those oaks are grown in a forest, they tend to be straight and true, because they're growing up through the forest and they're competing for light, so they grow like this. And those that are grown in a field take on a completely different form. And in a field-grown oak, there are many shapes, many sizes, which will come in handy when you're putting together a building. So once the tree's been felled and roughly shaped, it's then formed into pieces, and the rough cuts, or the rough work, is either done with wedges, which I've just turned off. That's novel. So there's either a wedge, which is driven into the wood and then smacked with a few sledgehammers, and the benefit of that is it splits the wood along the grain. And some people think that if you split along the grain rather than cutting against it, you get a stronger and more durable piece of timber. The alternative to that is to saw it either over a saw pit or on a trestle. And in this case, I like to think that this is the master carpenter up top, and this is the poor apprentice down below getting a face full of sawdust. And he does that after he's had a face full of sawdust for 5 years, he becomes a qualified carpenter. But there's a little bit more to it than that. And when the wood's been cut, it tends to be split then, or sawn, into these pieces. You either take a square out of the centre of the log, that's called a boxed heart. Cut it in half, it becomes halved. When people talk about half-timbered houses, it doesn't mean it's half timber and half brick. What it actually means is probably halved timbers. And then if it's quartered, that probably gives you a floor joist. And if it's slabbed, that can either give coverings on the wall, or if it's slabbed very thinly, it will form floorboards. We'll come on to that. And in terms of how they're shaped, you're working with green oak, which is fairly soft, as opposed to oak, which hardens over time. And I've seen very skilled carpenters using very, very high quality steel drill bits, and they burnt it out on a piece of 600-year-old oak. Because the older it gets, the harder it gets. But while it's green, it's fairly workable. So you shape it with an axe, or an adze, which will give you a curved finish, an axe, which will come true, and the auger, which is the drill bit, which they use to make the holes for the pegs, which we're going to come onto on the mortise and tenon joints. And of course, with a piece of wood like that as a size, maybe this big, there's a lot of force that you can put on that to drill down into the wood or to drill through the wood. And today, I'm going to look at three principal kinds of buildings, because these are the main kind of timber frames that are found certainly where I worked in South Staffordshire, but also generally throughout the West Midlands. In different parts of England, there are different kinds of framing, but this is what we tend to find around here. The earliest ones are crook frames, then we move on to close studding, and because close studding uses so much wood, slightly cheaper and more realistic way of doing it later, because they were running out of oak, is box framing. And box framing is the most common form in this part of the world. But common to all of them is the mortise and tenon joint. And the mortise is a hole, it's cut in a piece of timber, and the tenon, I was confused about this, which is the mortise and which is the tenon? And I thought, well, actually the tenon sticks out, and the tenon begins with T, and so does a tongue, and you stick your tongue out. So I remembered that's which is the tenon. Because I need ease in the mind, because I forget quite a lot quite quickly. And the most common myth is that curved timbers are ship's timbers. The number of times I've heard that, oh, this is built of old ship's timbers, the wood's curved. But are they? Now, I mean, on this boat, there's some curved timbers there, aren't there? You could easily reuse those in a house. There's some curved timbers around the top and around the sides. And, this is the sort of joint that we might find in some timber frame buildings. But rather than that myth, I think it's helpful to examine some of the facts and some of the evidence. So let's have a look at Khufu boat, which is approximately 4,500 years old. This is next to the pyramids in Giza. And this is the boat that the pharaoh would have sailed off into the great hereafter, if it ever went into the water. But of course it didn't, because it was just kept in a stone box. In fact, when this was found, it was found in 4,500 pieces, and they reassembled it. But it's very sophisticated carpentry. And I want to talk about this before we talk about the building, because there are some very sophisticated carpentry techniques in here. That's a pretty sophisticated joint. This is a pretty sophisticated way of keeping timbers together. That's a clever piece of work, isn't it? Yeah. And it isn't held together with pegs. It's held together with these ropes. So if it ever did go into the water, the wood would expand, the ropes would expand, but the ropes would dry out more quickly than the wood. So once it's been compressed together, it isn't going to come apart. And then added to the sophistication, there's just a close-up of it. But I think that's pretty clever, 4,500 years ago. And then here, the pieces that run into the side of the boat, these are dovetail joints. And this is what a dovetail joint looks like. And when I saw this, what fascinates me is that, so if they were making dovetail joints 4,500 years ago, how many years before that were they invented? I strongly believe, in terms of buildings, I believe in the term empiric failure. So you try something, if it doesn't work, you try something else. Where did I go wrong? What can we do? What can we do to improve things? So to see a joint as sophisticated as this 4,500 years ago does make me wonder, how long has the skill and the craft of carpentry been around?
Yeah.
And that's a recreation, I can't remember where I found it online, but that's a recreation of a cross section through Khufu's boat. So, the ship's timbers, or are they? Let's look at some facts. So, large parts of England were covered in forests. And the estimate was, the 16th century, start of the 16th century, 4 million acres. And some parts of the Midlands, where we are, the forests were so dense that early settlers avoided them. There were easier places where they could settle without chopping down hundreds or thousands of trees. There was also widespread depletion of the timber stocks. For shipbuilding, Royal Navy, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and the merchant fleet, they're using wood for charcoal for smelting iron, they're using wood for building, they're using it for fuel. So they reckon that by the end of the 17th century, so over a period of 200 years, 1 million acres of trees are felled. And to put that into some sort of context, if you look at Staffordshire, which runs from the Roaches down to Kimber, and across to the border with Cheshire and Swadlincote, which is nearly in Derbyshire, and Ashbourne. So Staffordshire is 1,049 square miles, which is 670,000 acres. So you've got to go almost half as much as the whole of the county of Staffordshire again to see how much forest was lost in that 200-year period. And then we move on to the fact, which is a fact, is that the Midlands is further from the sea than any other region. So why would you use ship's timbers here? Because it's quite difficult to do that. Because from Wolverhampton, it's 70 miles to the Wirral, it's 75 miles to the Welsh coast, and there's some pretty big mountains in between. It's 75 miles down to the top of the Bristol Channel, and there is the River Severn. And apparently the River Severn was navigable as far as Poole Quay, which is just outside Welshpool. It's an area that we know well. We've got a static van near Welshpool, and we often walk along the old Montgomery Canal to Poole Quay. But the point is that the Midlands is a long way from the coast. And of course, X hundred years ago, there's no roads. You're not going to bring a ship's timber along a drover's track, are you? And you know, Wolverhampton, this area generally is, it's pretty dense forest. My only concession to this is that apparently, up until the 19th century, the biggest industry in Bridgnorth was boat building. And the River Severn was navigable, but we're not talking enormous ships for that. So let's look a bit more logically about curved timbers. And I said that the earliest form of timber frame is a crook. And there are, this shows 6 different kinds of crooks. Full, raised, base, jointed. And do you remember those field-grown oaks? The different sizes in there? Well, if we look at this tree, put a curve in there, that looks quite like a crook to me. If you take one of those out and cut it down the middle, you get 2 matching halves, which is what a crook frame building is comprised of. Those are the timbers. So you've got the main ones, which are the crook blades, held together with tie beam, with braces. One of the most important pieces of timber is the crook spur, which goes from the crook blade into the crook stud. It's held in place with pegs, and then these 2 timbers are held in place with pegs that are driven through there. Here you've got a packing piece, so you can line up the purlins. On top of the purlins, you get the principal rafters, and then the laths, and then and the tiles on top of those. So if you look at this building in Bridgnorth, this is supposed to be the oldest building in Bridgnorth. The garden bar, it's in Lower Town, just before you get to the river. So there's the Falcon Hotel, and you start to get towards the bridge, and there's the garden bar. And if we look at half of the garden bar and half of the crook truss, you can see how that theory is put into practice. So this is a building in South Staffordshire. It's the Crook Barn at Great Chapwell. This was taken by one of my predecessors, an old slide, probably back to 1977 or so. Building wasn't listed, it was in poor condition, it was converted into a house. But it's unusual because at this end, you've got a crook. At the far end, you've got the box framing. And inside, there's quite an eclectic mix of roof timbers. So, there's 3 or 4 different trusses that form the roof, that support the roof rather. I had a phone call from the owner in 2008 to say, Dave, we've got some problems. And by then, the building was listed. But the problem was that the workmanship was absolutely atrocious. I've seen some bad building, but it doesn't get much worse than this. I mean, the blocks aren't bonded properly. They weren't vertical. Some of them had been cut in half so they could fit them around the crook blades. These were some fairly crude modern installations, although the girding beam was still original. And I'd put this together. I'd taken a photograph of the end of the building and put this together and did a drawing from it, because I've often found that it's a fairly good drawing, but a rough drawing like this, rather than an accurately scaled drawing, which is true to the last inch, is still a very effective and very helpful way of showing people what's there. It's a quick and easy way to make a good record. So, having done this, in theory, the owner had committed an offence. He carried out work on a listed building, which affected its character and appearance. He didn't have listed building consent for it. But with the best will in the world, you're not going to prosecute for that, because if he hadn't done it, there'd be no way of seeing what a poor condition the building is in. So we talked it through and said, well, how are we going to address these problems? And the answer was, I know it's controversial to some, but I can live with it. So what we did was, or what we agreed was, if you extend the building by about 18 inches and put this glass frame around it, you can keep all of the original timbers. Now, you could have done some sort of repair around those timbers, but in doing so, it's inevitable that a lot of the original fabric would be removed. It would be clearly visible, and there's nothing wrong with clearly visible repairs. They don't need to be hidden. If they're well done, they should be expressed, they should be exposed. But we decided this was a more sensitive way forward in terms of keeping as much historic fabric for as long as possible. And that's a general principle that applies in conservation work to all sorts of materials. So what happens then inside is that the crooks, whatever their condition, they're now preserved. We're treated with Danish oil, they're never going to get any worse, and they can be fully seen. And the crook spurs, which are hugely important, the crook spurs are still in place. The sole plate has gone, but it had gone anyway. But in order to ensure that there was an element of stability, this was installed, which is a stainless steel tie bar, which is held in place with these tension bolts, which, my personal opinion, I think that's a beautiful piece of work. I think that's lovely engineering, and it serves an important purpose. At the other end of that particular room, one of that eclectic collection of roof supports is now fully exposed and saved, and I think that was a reasonable result. So if we now look at where does my information come from, and at half time, while we're having a coffee, there's a number of books there which have been, they're not quite my Bibles, but there's a lot of information in those books. They're exceptionally helpful. So we got this first one, This is the best book I've ever found for naming the timbers which are used in the buildings. Discovering timber frame building, that's one of the little Shire books, costs about £2, especially if you go in a second-hand shop. That's also very good for explaining some of the basics. The British Oak, which is the story of individual trees throughout the nation, but also some interesting facts in terms of how many trees are felled for a building or a ship like the Mary Rose. R.J. Brown, Chartered Building Surveyor, got work on lots of different frames throughout England. Very helpful. Conservation of Timber Building by Freddie Charles from Worcester. This was one of the first of its kind, and for a lot of people this is still pretty much the Bible as far as restoration of timber frame building, conservation of timber buildings is concerned. Vernacular Buildings of Shropshire, huge piece of work by a lady called Madge Moran. And I think this started life as a project when she went along to adult education class somewhere, and she became fascinated and did surveyed timber frame buildings throughout Shropshire. Actually, fabulous book. English Medieval House, that's quite a big tome. And then Manor Houses of England, the building on the front cover there. I did some work a few years ago as a consultant for Solihull Council, when a piece of land opposite this had been allocated for housing, and English Heritage, Historic England were unhappy about that decision. They said there had been no proper assessment of how those new houses would affect the setting of this Grade 1 listed building. So I went along and had a look, and I think and hope they reached the compromise, which was not to build on that land. And finally, this was exceptionally helpful. It's the most helpful piece of literature I've ever referenced. I was looking on my phone one day and I saw an enormous article about the restoration of Notre Dame. I thought, where's this? And it was in GQ magazine. I thought, is this really GQ magazine? So we were in Bridgnorth on the Saturday, and I went into W.H. Smith's, and sure enough, GQ magazine was in there. So I started leafing through it, and in the index, there was the cover story of what Beyonce did next. But the really important part was the inside story of the painstaking restoration of Notre Dame. And I was absolutely fascinated by how it was done, and how it was done so quickly. So I've still got the magazine at home, and that's the opening spread. And one of the reasons that they were able to recreate the roof after the devastating fire was that 7 years before the fire, an architect was studying building conservation in one of France's leading universities. And every weekend for a year, he went along, so he was freezing in the winter, roasting in the summer, in the roof space, surveying all the timbers. And in surveying the timbers, he provided drawings of looking through the length of the building, cross-sections through the building. So the restoration, it was difficult, it was challenging, but it was a known quantity because they knew what they were looking to replicate. Replicating was a challenge. They needed 1,200 trees, which they found throughout France, about 150 years old, 60 feet tall, including rare, irregularly shaped trees for the nave and the choir, in a quest to find the perfect wood with a perfect curve, which could have been Beyonce, but maybe not. There were some concessions to using modern machinery, because if you've got 12 miles of logs, that's a lot of log to cut by hand. So they cut two of the faces were cut on a sawmill, and the others were squared with an axe. One of the fascinating things was that they actually made new axes to do the work. So new ones were made. So you've got these long-handled ones called, go back to that. So you've got the long-handled axes called axe de gosière, to to take off large quantities of wood, and then the dull wires, which are the short blades. And I think something's fascinating me, the fact that the blades were forged with two different kinds of iron. So they're very hard on the edge to maintain a good cutting edge. But here, it's a softer material because of the vibration. If you imagine chopping away at a tree for 8 hours a day, or whatever it was, you know, you try to make it as comfortable as possible. Then when the trees have been felled and started to be shaped, they're laid out on these enormous construction floors in a shed, perfectly flat piece of ground, held together with literally hundreds of clamps before being jointed in traditional ways. And we then move on to close studying, because close studying was a medium through which an owner could express his wealth. I mean, apart from the fact that it uses a hell of a lot of timber, houses they'll have different details. So these Bressumer beams that across the top of a jetty, the Bressumer beams may be carved. And it takes time to carve them. If it takes time, it costs money. So the more elaborate the carving you get, that's a visible display of the owner's wealth. It isn't there just for the sake of it. It's like, you know, how detailed is the pattern in your block paved drive, or how big is the satellite dish on your roof. You know, it's an expression of wealth, maybe not taste. This building in Kinver, this was many years before I had any involvement with conservation. It's called the Old Grammar School House. It's the finest example of timber framing in South Staffordshire. The work was designed and overseen by the most gifted architect I've ever had the privilege of knowing or working with, a chap called John Grieve Smith, who lived and worked in Kinver, and an incredibly gifted man, a beautiful example of close studying. I was down there last year in the village taking photographs for this talk, and I happened to see the owner got out of his car, unloaded his shopping. So I wandered up and said, I introduced myself, told him what I used to do and what I do now. And I said, could I just have a look at the back of your building? You happy for me to take photographs of it? He says, yeah, just come around. He says, we'll go around. He said, we'll have a cup of tea. So we had a cup of tea and sat at the table. And he told me an interesting fact about this building, which that somebody from London, possibly from historic England, but certainly, you know, an expert in these matters, had been down and said that originally this building had been used as a chapel, and that these were chapel windows, small chapel windows, and that this little opening here had a particular function, in that it was a niche where food would be left for lepers. Whether it's true, I don't know. It's a story worth telling. And then moving on to Who Farmhouse. I haven't got a picture of the whole of the house, but that doesn't matter, because what is important to me are the certain details. So the reference here to the first floor, having close studying, uninterrupted by a middle rail. A rail is a piece of wood that goes across, a stud is a vertical piece of timber. There are 17th century square panels with straight braces, which we'll see. 2 first floor casements to the southwest of the building. The left-hand one has leaded light and is an original window opening, so that's 400 years old or more. And in the southeast bay, a cruciform arrangement of heavily moulded ceiling beams and joists with panelled spandrels carved with fleurons, which is an unusual detail, which we're going to see. The work here was carried out by a local carpenter, a chap called Simon Harper, who works based at the Greenwood Trust in Ironbridge. He's the most gifted carpenter I've ever seen work, hugely skilled. And how this has been carried out is the corner post has eroded, so a new piece of timber is let in. Here's one of the old diagonal braces. The mortise at the end of that was intact, but needed a piece at the bottom there, and also a new mortise added to this cross rail and held in place with that peg. The joint, or the fixing here between the original and the new, that would be some form of resin and held in place in the first place with stainless steel screws. You use stainless steel because anything else would be corroded by the tannins in the oak. That's an example of the stud being cut out, a new piece of timber being let in with new tenons on the end of these rails. And again, a drawing similar to the one I've done before, just to show how this is carried out. And how it's carried out is to drill a series of small holes behind the face of the timber, then to open it out into a rectangular form with very sharp chisels, and then to insert this slip of wood. This is the this is the base of one of the studs. That's the breast of the beam. That's the cross rail, the big cross rail between the ground and the first floor. And this technique here, which is to splice in a piece of timber behind the weathered face, is something that Simon and various colleagues had worked on at the Weald and Downland Museum in Sussex. So we have the Avencroft Museum at Bromyard, which is really a museum of buildings, but the Weald and Downland Museum is a working museum, is that they run courses on an annual basis to try and refine the techniques, and they're always looking for new and better ways to repair the timber. And that's what's been done here. We'll see the finished result on the next slide. So when it's done like that, when the brick panels go back in, remember what I said about an honest repair? That's what it is. You know? Yeah, there's the new timber. You're not trying to hide it. This is a repair that was done to that 16th century window. And the reason that the work is so incredibly fine, incredibly detailed, is that Simon actually trained as a cabinet maker. So rather than starting big and working small, he started small, very, very fine, and then took it up a scale for whole buildings. But this is carpentry on a historic building of the very highest order. And one thing I haven't brought tonight, I apologise for that. I'm a bit distracted today. I've been to a funeral of a very close friend. But what we've got here is this guy is putting the bricks in between the studs. And if you simply push it in, then I'm going to go over the other side. If you simply push the brick into place, then if the timber shrinks, or with any sort of pressure, or with even wind, you know, as things start to move and erode, the brick panel could be prone to movement. So what they've done is these bricks have been shaped, and I'm sorry I haven't brought one, I apologise for that, but the bricks are shaped with a nib at each end. So what the guy does is he puts the brick in at an angle, then he turns it round, because the brick has been chamfered at the bottom. Ready to kick off?
Questions?
We haven't finished the presentation yet.
Oh, right. Okay.
Right, second away, round two. First round, 3 minutes. The box framing in Timber High Street. Don't go through all of that. The only thing I want to highlight is the official description says 17th century with early 18th century additions. The building had a checkered history. I went there when there was an elderly gentleman who lived there. There was only one room that he'd really restored to anything like its original condition. It was a first floor room.
Turn your mic on if it's not on.
I thought I had.
Yeah, push it right to, that's it, right, Chris.
Is that
That's better.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for that. And in the one of the first floor bedrooms, this guy had scraped all of the paint, anything off the timbers, and he'd done it with a piece of glass, or with pieces of glass, because a piece of glass is sometimes better than glass paper. You know, get a really fine edge on it. You need a lot of glass for it though. So a checkered history. So it was vacant for several years after the owner sadly passed away, and it was purchased by a local developer, and as a council we granted listed building consent for repairs. Repairs were carried out to an appalling standard, even worse than the old barn in Great Chatwell. You know, there were walls that weren't true, there were walls that didn't support anything, there were walls that weren't built. Oh, dreadful, absolutely dreadful. So we prosecuted the developer, took him to court, found him to comply with the conditions, and he was found guilty, and he was fined thousands of pounds, and he subsequently went bankrupt, which as far as I'm concerned was a good result, because it meant he wouldn't ruin any more buildings. You might be able to build a garage somewhere, but keep away from timber frame buildings, please. The property was then purchased by the West Midlands Historic Buildings Trust, and at the time I was the minute secretary for the trust. Plans were prepared by John Grieve Smith, who I said before lived and worked in Kinver, an unbelievably gifted architect. Somebody told me once that at the age of 5, John could draw a house, and it was a proper likeness of it. And after almost 10 years, this was after the building became vacant, after 10 years, the building was properly restored. Superb workmanship carried out by a firm called Sandys from Stafford. And the age of the building was determined by dendrochronology, which is very simple. I'll try to explain it here. So if you look at this first tree, this was felled in 2005. So if you count the growth rings, back to the middle, there are 39 growth rings. So that means it was planted in 1966. And this tree, say, was planted in 1978. And if you count the growth rings, there's 58 of them, so it's planted in 1920. And where those growth rings coincide, if you imagine laying one on top of the other, it looks like a barcode. And the way this works is that a tree will be drilled with a hollow core drill. And what you take out is, effectively, is a long pencil shape. That pencil shape is then polished. When it's polished, it exposes the growth rings. And the database for this, I think it was started by taking timbers from the Houses of Parliament. The timbers in the Houses of Parliament, they knew when it was built, they knew when the timber had been felled, and from that, they had the first barcode. And when they subsequently did cores on other buildings, eventually they found that they could get the growth rings would match up over a long period, and a database was built up, and it's very, very accurate, because by and large, wherever the tree grows in Britain, whether it's a good summer and it grows a lot, and whether it's a bad summer it doesn't grow quite as much, that is consistent, pretty consistent nationwide, and it's certainly consistent enough to give a database which enables buildings to be dated accurately. And the reason that's relevant at Kinver is that the official list description referred to mid-17th century building with 18th century alterations, but inside this door in one of the bedrooms is beautifully carved, absolutely beautiful. This, you know, apart from the sort of almost the linen folds there, the very delicate flowers, roundels there, with somebody's initials and the date 1577. So it isn't a 17th century building; it's a 16th century building, and sometimes, you know, we list descriptions serve a purpose, but sometimes they were based on a drive past. You know, drive past, oh yeah, 1773. And there's no time, or there was no time, to go internally and examine buildings. Sometimes the owners didn't want you to anyway. But that's another story. I'll move away from that. That's the initials, the guy who had it, WE. We never found out who WE was. And in 1997, this won an award given by English Heritage. It was called the Carpenters Award. It's given by the Worshipful Company of Carpenters, and this was a winner for the conservation of woodwork, basically conservation of timber frame building. That was the best in England, and you know, I was so pleased, and well, not just pleased, but to go down to London to the building, not the Guildhall. The original building was destroyed in the war. Second World War, but there's a new building, but inside, as you go up the stairs, there's a board with all the names of the master of the Worshipful Company of Carpenters, dated back to the 15th century. So for me, you know, as a black country kid who were very well educated, and I wasn't, because I was worse than useless at school. You know, to walk up that staircase and see all these names going back hundreds of years, and to think, you know, golly, I've been part of a scheme that's won this award. It was fantastic. It was one of the proudest moments of my working life. And this is a piece of work that John Grieve Smith put together to establish how many trees were felled in order to put together that one building. And I'm not going to go through all of it, because, you know, there's a lot on there. But just, if you look at it very quickly, so the corner posts, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 of those, which are 16 foot long. And then at this part of the building, below the jetty, there's not 8, there's 4 of those at 8 foot long. And he's done that sort of analysis for all of the timbers. And the conclusion he comes to is that in order to get a timber of that length, you're probably looking at oaks which are 45 foot tall, with a spread of maybe 40 feet. So each tree takes up 15 square yards. So at 225 yards, divided into 4,840, you get about 21 trees per acre. This one house takes between 85 and 100 trees. That's for one house. So we're not spoken about depletion of the oaks and depletion of the wood stocks for whatever reason. And to my knowledge, South Staffordshire, where I worked for many years, there's 680 listed buildings. About 140 of those are timber framed. They might have new faces on them, but they're timber framed. And that's without the timber that goes into a Georgian building for the floors and the floorboards, etc. All of which are going to be locally sourced. So there's about 100 trees. Then on top of that, there's the floorboards, you know, which are taken out of a piece of maybe 12-inch square. And that in itself requires something like another 5 large trees. So it's a huge number of trees just for one timber frame building. And that's not a huge building, is it? You know, that's not a 3 or 4 story one. It's not a high house in Stafford or some such. Then there's the Whittington Inn. The Whittington Inn, I had a phone call one day from a spy sorry, a friend who worked in Kidney, he was a local chemist, rang me up. He says, Dave, he said, I don't remember any applications for repairs at the Whittington Inn. I said, that's because there haven't been any. He said, I think you ought to go down and have a look and see what's been done. So I went and I had a look to see what had been done. Now, it's in the nature of my job that, well, certainly how I used to operate, was not to take any prisoners. And if somebody had contravened the legislation, I threatened to take them to court, and I had a good track record. Certainly had a good track record here. So I spoke to the manager of the pub, I spoke to the contractors, and they say, this is, you know, it's like for like repairs. So on the end gable, they'd taken out, remember the tie beam? Runs at the top of the corner post? They'd taken out the tie beam, which was one piece of oak, about 12 inches wide and 16 inches deep. They'd taken out that piece of oak, they'd replaced it with two pieces of hemlock. The principal rafter was held on with this bit of angle iron with coach bolts, which were already starting to split the wood. The brick panels had been taken out. They were going to replace it with polystyrene. Now I did a bit of research, and I couldn't find any reference to 16th century polystyrene. I tried, couldn't find any. Do you remember when I showed a photograph of mortise and tenon joint? How the mortise goes into the tenon. So, conservation officer, you always take a Swiss Army knife with you. You never know where it's going to be needed. And you're not supposed to be able to put a blade into that joint because there's a tenon behind to stop it. Well, there would be if it wasn't a plank of wood that had been nailed on. But this was like for like repairs. Oh, and there's some of the bolts that hold together the two pieces of hemlock, which is softwood. So we had words. Where on earth has that come from? Oh yes, that's just to prove that you can't get a knife because the tenon's stopping it. So we took them to court, and the case was heard here in Wombourne Magistrates. And on the steps of the court, the day of the hearing, the owner said, we know we shouldn't have done it. If you don't go ahead with the prosecution, we'll appoint a proper architect, we'll appoint proper people, and we'll do the work. And I thought, well, as far as I'm concerned, that's a win-win. Okay, it took a long time to put a case together to put it to court, but in the knowledge that they were going to do it properly, that was a more productive way forward. So that's what happened. So this guy Ian Evans, he's got a single piece of oak. It isn't two pieces of hemlock bolted back to back. He's got his string line there. He's going to make a new tenon to go at the end of the principal rafter. This joist here is going to sit in that gap. The piece of timber is going to go along there. It's going to rest in there, and that's going to hold a new upright, a new rail to support the principal rafters. An important detail on here, because where this new rail is fitted into the corner post, the timber there was badly decayed. If you remember Who Farmhouse, where I spoke about the quality of the timber work and how they put a new piece in on the corner post, that was cut square. This is a better way to do it, because, excuse me, if it's cut square, then water will run down the face of the building, and it will get into the gap. And timber, especially oak, is very strong across the grain, but the end grain is where the water gets in. So if it's cut back at 45 degrees, then any water that runs down is going to run off, rather than soak into the end grain. So that was a hugely important detail, that was. And you know, credit where it was due. They did a good job, but that was just on that one gable. That was until 1997, when major repair work was required. The previous owners, I'm not going to name them, they were firm developers from Haleshoe, who used to build a lot of houses and eventually built industrial estates. The building was bought by Banksy's, and Banksy's did an absolutely superb job. You don't need to be an expert to appreciate that the panels and the wattle and daub here isn't in very good condition. It's sort of obvious. What you can't see on here was the way that this girding beam had been, inverted commas, repaired. What they'd done is they'd taken out the original timber, they'd put some shuttering in, and behind that they'd poured mass concrete. And you know, I've seen better concrete in foundations of buildings, and they'd use that as a structure. Now, this is a Grade 2-star building. It was, well, it was beyond belief. So a controversial decision was to take out all of the timbers and lay them out on the car park. Because it's a 2-star building, English Heritage are involved, the amenity societies such as the Society of Ancient Monuments, Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, they're all involved in the process. And I knew that taking out this amount of timber was going to be controversial. But if it's laid out on the car park, at least people have the opportunity to appreciate that there really is no option other than to replace. You know, great believer in repairs where it's possible. Here, it wasn't possible. It had to be replaced. So the new timbers were laid out on a flat surface, and that's how timber frame buildings were always constructed. They were put together on the ground and they're raised up with a pulley. They're not built in situ, they're built on the floor and then raised up. Some interesting techniques that were employed. So this is an example of the new, this is the new wattle, which comprises of roughly chopped laths. Do you remember on Who Farm I spoke about a groove that the wattle is woven into? So there's a groove down the inside of these studs. There's an unusual detail, which you can just about see over here. Can you see that faint line, that faint straight line down there? That was something that hadn't been tried before. So into there, they put a very, very thin strip, about an inch wide, a very thin strip of stainless steel, in the hope that that would stop any moisture driving through. Because we're working with green oak, it's going to shrink. And if it shrinks, there's always potential then for the daub to, if it shrinks, there's potential for moisture getting in the corners. And then, given what I've just said about replacement, where we could keep the original, we did. Spliced new pieces in, a new collar there, but we kept the original decorative braces. And this is the daub. The daub was a particularly interesting mix. I remember going there one day. I had two meetings that day. My first meeting was down at Kinver. The second meeting was at Western Park with Lord Bradford. So I had to be sort of whistling boots to go to Western Park. So I'd chosen, it was a bad decision to go here first, because the daub is comprised of lime and sand and chopped straw and cow manure. The cow manure was delivered in builders' bags, 1 ton bags, out about 12 of them. It's all mixed together. It's then thrown on roughly. There is a suggestion, I don't know if it's true, but there's a suggestion that, you know, people would stand on both sides, throw it from the inside, throw it from the outside, and if the door goes through the wattle, that's where the expression "here's blood in your eye" comes from. I don't know if it's true, it's a good story. It's then sort of flattened off with a wooden trowel. It's scored to give a key for the final coats, and the final coats of render that go on is simply lime and sand. You don't use cement. And then it's painted with lime wash. Inside, I found a wall painting. This is a guy from the Cotswolds who's carefully cleaning it. I think it's, you know, cotton buds and distilled water, something like that. That's still on display now in the main room downstairs. The side elevation to the road was particularly interesting. You can see at the top is a combination. Well, the top is a combination. Sorry, the top is box framing. The base is close studded. It was all built at the same time, but the exact form of this was an unknown until they'd taken out the decayed timbers. And taking the decayed timbers out in order to put in this new, or this heavily repaired girding beam, on the underside of what was left of the old girding beam, there were some diamond-shaped holes. And those diamond-shaped holes were the mullions for these windows. So these were able to be recreated, leaded lights put in, and this was taking it back to its original design. Probably the most interesting feature we found after they'd removed this mass concrete. They put in some new corner posts. There was just enough left of one of them to distinguish what sort of detail was required there. And at the side of the porch, we discovered this opening. So there's the door, and the corridor is here. So what was this little alcove? And nobody involved had ever seen one before. But at the foot of the alcove, there was a bricked up opening. And in the main room downstairs, there's this enormous fireplace. And that opening there is down in this corner. And what we strongly suspect is that lobby is where a night watchman or some such would sit at night, and he'd scrape out some of the embers to keep himself warm on a cold winter's night. And it's a fascinating detail, and, you know, none of us had ever come across anything like that before, and I certainly haven't come across one since. And in 1999, having won the Carpenters Award, which 1997, which I thought was a once in a lifetime award, lo and behold, it was held every 2 years, and, you know, this also won the award in 1999, which was, well, it was fantastic. And everything that was done here was done for a purpose. So the new timbers were deliberately left in the natural state. The original timbers were left black to show that they were some of the original timbers. The windows had been added as oriel windows. There was evidence that that was what the original windows looked like. There was evidence for the colour of the brickwork or the panels. And there were several layers of paint, apart from the white, which everybody had seen. Underneath the white, there was this yellow ochre colour, and underneath that, there was quite a dark salmon pink. And we thought, if this is painted pink, there's going to be a bit of local reaction to that. So let's go for something safe. So we went for the yellow ochre, which was similar, not quite the same, similar to what had been used on 19 and 20 High Street. I'll say everything that was done there was done for a reason. There was a logbook prepared that should have been kept by the owners, so that they would be informed as to what had been done and why it had been done. But then it was sold, and I left the council. Which is why it breaks my heart now. For me, this might as well be the Oddfellows at Compton. This could be any Banksy's, well, Banksy's don't exist anymore, do they? This could now be any roadhouse, anywhere, if I still worked at the council. Well, one, I wouldn't have granted consent for it, and two, I'd have made them take it off. But that's another story. That's another story. My final one, this is in Codsall. Gentleman was looking earlier at the drawings that I'd done for a pub in the village where we have our static band near Welshpool. And I'd like to do the same for this one, because I think this is the oldest building in apart from the church, this is the oldest building in Codsall. This is an extract from the tithe map. So this is parcel number 58. This is the entry in the tithe awards. If we home in on it, we can see that the owner was the trustees of the late Joseph Smith. The occupier was John Hook and others, and it comprised 5 houses. If we just go back to these cottages here, which is now occupied, one's a private house and one's an optician's. These are called, or somebody calls these, Cromwell's cottages. The local story is that Oliver Cromwell and his troops were garrisoned in Codsall when they were looking for King Charles. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you know, if there's enough soldiers to need to be housed, are they going to go in a couple of little cottages, or are they going to go in a much more substantial house? And I strongly suspect that they went to this one. So it's clear from this aerial photograph, this modern aerial photograph, it's clear that this is all one building, isn't it? In different ownerships now, but that's pretty good evidence. This is a photograph that's held at the County Archives, taken in 1922, which shows that at that time the building had a jetty. There was a metal bar there because, you know, it was in pretty poor condition over 100 years ago. So yeah, that's an enlargement of part of the picture. This is undated, but it was published in the 1935 Silver Jubilee album, and between 1922 and 1935, the jetty had disappeared, and the front wall and the ground floor had been brought forward by about 15 inches. Again, this is undated. It's thought to be between 1940 and 1960, but the repairs to the brick panels seem to be the same as this photograph, which was taken in 1959. That's the rear of the building, and what interests me is that although it was described in the tithe, which was dated about 1848, it was described as 5 houses. I strongly suspect that, you know, this is a house of quite high status, and the timbering here is completely different, and I strongly suspect that was a barn attached to the house, which wasn't uncommon, you know, a farmhouse and an attached barn, and that would have been big enough to garrison troops who were looking for King Charles. That's what it looked like in, I think it was 1988. This was one of the first timber frame buildings I was involved in any aspect. There are 36 pieces of timber on that front elevation, and 31 had to be replaced. That's how bad it was. The worst was the tie beam, which I've described as the most important piece in a timber framed house. What we were dealing with, and it is absolutely unique, this wasn't a timber frame building, this was a peat frame building. You could put your hand inside the tie beam and pull out a lump of potting compost. And the reason you could do that is that the building had been repaired in unconventional ways. The unconventional materials comprised the Express Star, ladies' tights or stockings, polyfiller. That was then painted with white latex, and it was then painted with black bitumen. Now, I know we laugh about it, but they probably thought that painting it with latex and bitumen would stop the water getting in. You can't stop the water getting in because the paint cracks and the water gets in. And if it's held back behind an impervious barrier, there's only one way it can go. Water's got to come out somewhere. It ain't going to go outside, it's going to go inside and rot the timbers, which is exactly what had happened here, which is why 31 out of 36 pieces of timber had to be replaced. So over the years, I've had a close involvement with 3 Civic Trust Awards, Brat's Locks here in Wombourne, 19 and 20 High Street, Kimber, Holy Austin Rock Houses at Kimber, 2 successive Carpenters Company Awards for the best restoration of a timber frame building in England, MBE in 2002, and quite a number of regional, county and local conservation awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southern Staffordshire Partnership in 2011, which is when I left the council and set up my own consultancy, and I've just retired. In fact, I retired, I said I went to a funeral today. There was a close friend of mine, one of my mentors, and he was like me, he was a little bit older than me, he was 77, I'm nearly 75. He enjoyed his work, he was good at it, and he was ill. And when I heard that, I went home with my wife, we'd been to the theatre in Wolverhampton, I said, that's it, no more work. I love what I do. As far as I'm concerned, I've rarely been to work. I've been paid to do what I love. I've almost had a well-paid hobby, but not anymore. It's got to finish. Apart from the 3 that I'm working on at the moment. I'm committed to those. No, I'm committed to those. No, I've started working. I've started, so I'll finish. Yeah. But I've turned down 4 jobs in the last 2 weeks.
Goodness.